record this. And again, you know, Samantha's here to present on post-school outcomes. And I have to say, over the years, just a little thing, Sam, learning a little bit more about those outcomes and some of the data has really helped me have a better understanding of needs from youth and where youth are when they're leaving school. So I find it to be very interesting and very useful. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce Miss Samantha Klein.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks, Steve. So for some reason, I had thought we were going to talk post-school outcomes and the transition planning process. So I have a lot of extra slides, but we don't have to go through all of them. So we can stick to post-school outcomes, but I can also give you a quick and dirty introduction to the transition planning process, and then I can jump around in my slides. We can be pretty informal here. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt. Yeah, and we'll just keep it kind of relaxed. So let me share my screen. Okay. Right, so a few things that I did put into this slide deck today that we can jump around include some transition related special education indicators. So these are what we report on to the federal government, to the Office of Special Education Programs for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So at the state level, we have 17 different indicators that we manage and collect data on across the state, and once a year submit that as part of our state performance plan, annual performance report, SPP APR. There are technically four transition related indicators. Two of them I can focus on today. So indicator 13 is that transition plan, secondary transition, and then indicator 14 is post-school outcomes, ESO. And I do have some specific data for Pima County. And then depending on how we're feeling, we can have a little discussion on how important this data is to a community of practice and how it can inform some decisions that we make, some projects that we might want to dive into in the future. So just some key acronyms, if you aren't familiar, I'll use IEP, Individualized Education Program. If I dive a little bit more into depth into the transition planning process, you might hear me say KSA for knowledge, skills, and abilities. You'll find those in occupational profiles, job descriptions. They're really helpful as you're aligning what kind of career the student is interested in and what they have strengths in, and what kind of KSAs are needed for that job to make sure that the student actually has the strengths or needs to develop some strengths. You'll hear PSO for post-school outcomes. MPG is that measurable post-secondary goal. It's part of the transition plan. And then SPIN data is what you collect when you're doing age-appropriate transition assessments. So you're looking for strengths, preferences, interests, and needs data. So I mentioned that there are 4 specific indicators. And I will say that I did not make a copy of this presentation, but I'll give you guys a link to where you can find essentially these same slides. In some of our secondary transition has a few Padlets where you can find some of this information. But so there are 4 indicators related to transition planning, and there's a critical interrelationship to them. So if we look at this visual here, and I start with the top left-hand, I guess, quadrant, indicator 13. So if we have a quality transition plan that we followed best practices, it's really going to reasonably enable the student to make progress towards their measurable post-secondary goals, then they're going to be more engaged in school. They aren't going to drop out, which is indicator 2. They're going to hopefully graduate, which is indicator 1. And then within a year after exiting high school, they will hopefully have some successful post-school outcomes, or indicator 14. And now that indicator 14 or PSO data, you can hopefully then use as a district, or even in this case, a community of practice, to inform decisions about your transition programming, your other programs that you have in your district, so that you can determine what's working and what's not. Maybe there are some success stories in your data. Perhaps there are some students with certain disability categories that are doing really well, and maybe there's a few that aren't. And so maybe you can hone in on a focus area to create a new program, or to give more attention to. And then again, start that cycle, have quality transition plans, stay in school, graduate, better post-school outcomes. So there's a nice connection there. And so that's why I wanted to spend some time talking through indicator 13. And I'll probably just keep it short and sweet. And if we want to backtrack later and go into the specific components, we can. I just want to be respectful. I know we plan till 5, but let's maybe try and practice that new 1 hour if we want. So indicator 13, that is secondary transition. It's the transition planning requirements. So again, our role as educators is to reasonably enable our students to meet those post-secondary goals. And you'll hear this, but they'll have post-secondary goals in at least employment and education and training, and then independent living as needed. So there are 8 components to indicator 13. And just so you are aware, for as we collect data, we have a team at the agency, our program support and monitoring specialists, and they collect some sample IEPs from different districts across the state and essentially grade them. And the goal is a 100% compliance for indicator 13. So for those plans, it's all 8 components are there and they're done appropriately per compliance. And I don't have the link here, but there's some materials on like the citation for IDEA is there, or you could look on the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition. There's an indicator 13 checklist. And then on our ADE website, we have the actual, they're called guide steps. It's what those program support and monitoring specialists are actually looking for when they're looking at an IEP. So that's a really critical tool that we share with all of our educators. But the team here in the secondary transition team and special projects that I've been a part of, we really focus on best practices for secondary transition. But just to understand those kind of bare bones to indicator 13, one of those components is that the student, well, I'll backtrack, that you're putting the transition plan in place no later than the student's 16th birthday. Best practice tells us to do that a little bit earlier. We sometimes see plans at age 14, but it needs to be in place by the 16th birthday. That's what is the requirement. And so those students, you are inviting the student to all of those IEP meetings when the transition plan will be discussed. That doesn't necessarily mean the student is going to attend, but you have put or lead the meeting or really truly be engaged, but you've at least met, you've sent the invitation, you invited the student is the compliance requirement there. Another piece is updating the transition plan annually. So you're collecting more data about the student, refining some of the goals, refining some of the activities once a year as you meet and as the student makes progress. Another piece, and I'm going to actually highlight here, the actual transition plan itself typically has these 5 areas. You're going to have a documented age-appropriate transition assessment. You're going to have at least your 2 measurable post-secondary goals, one in education and training, one in employment. You may have a 3rd in independent living. You'll have your coordinated set of transition activities, courses of study. So that's identifying the specific courses that would align back to the measurable post-secondary goals, and then aligned annual IEP goals. So IEPs already have their annual goals that the student is working towards, but how are those aligned back and connected to the measurable post-secondary goal? So there's kind of a clear thread, at least through those 5 components, that everything is supporting the measurable post-secondary goal. Do you have assessment data that shows you why that goal is appropriate? Do you have activities, courses of study, and aligned annual IEP goals that will reasonably enable the student to make progress? And then another component is that when you're inviting outside agencies, so provider agencies, voc rehab counselors, DDD support coordinators, behavioral health professionals, and foster care reps, whoever's kind of an outside agency, that there needs to be consent from the parent or guardian or the student who has reached the age of majority. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the person from the outside agency attends. There just needs to be that prior consent and then the invitation. So if I go on, I don't have that slide, but we do know that interagency collaboration is a predictor of post-school success. And so it's really critical to include all of those partners as an educator. I mean, and really as the family and the students themselves, can they think of who else supports them outside of the school day that would be valuable at their IEP meetings, especially when they're talking transition. So I just want to talk through, I guess I kind of talked through these steps a little bit too, but I'll go over this image. And then if there's specific questions about some of the steps, I can kind of jump around and we can go over those, and then we can talk post-school outcomes. So this is a visual that we've put together at the agency just to kind of clarify what are those 5 pieces of the transition plan, and what are some ways to get to those and to use best practices. So again, we're referencing the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative. Their website, I believe, is transitionta.org. And so this visual here, if we start with step 1, that is the age-appropriate transition assessment piece, when you're doing multiple assessments to collect information about the student's strengths. So what are some things that they do well? Preferences, what are some actions or some things that they actually do? So maybe they don't do them well. Maybe we're thinking of hobbies, or if they have a job, maybe they haven't gotten a good review about that job, or maybe they haven't got paid for one of their hobbies yet or something, but it's an action that they're taking. Could even be that action of choosing an elective course because they're interested in photography, they're taking a photography course. An A in that photography course would demonstrate that they do it well. So we're looking for strengths, preferences, and then interests. That's going to be what the student wants or what they like to do. And that's usually just going to be self-reported information or something you might collect from like those career cluster assessments you find online, those kind of quizzes you find online. And then you're also looking at maybe their career-related needs. So what are maybe some disability-related needs or some skill sets that the student has yet to develop that may inhibit their access or their success towards their post-secondary goals. So do you have data on that information? Because those are some things that could be addressed in the rest of the transition plan. So once you have all of that data as a team, you can then make the decision about the post-secondary goals. So again, you're basing that information on the assessments, and that way you're removing your own bias. You're removing any opinions from it. You're actually letting the data tell the story. So you're, again, writing one on employment, and that's going to be that ultimate career goal. What is the student going to do? Maybe not a year later, maybe even 5 years later. And as the student ages, you can make that goal a little bit more specific. So when a student is a freshman, it might just be after graduation, Susie will work as a doctor. But as you collect more data, as you get to know the student, the next year might be after graduation, Susie will work full-time as a pediatrician. And you're further enhancing the specificity as you learn about the student. And then your education and training goal is going to be the education and training, the licensure requirements that is needed for that career goal. So again, think of that needle and thread. You're seeing that connection between the goals. And if you do have an independent living goal, ideally, that's going to be a goal that's going to address a skill the student would need to do independently in order to access or be successful in those other post-secondary areas. So that could be a student who has diabetes and has to manage their insulin levels, or a student with behavioral health concerns and has to manage appointments or medication independently when they're going to college to make it to class or to make it to work and be successful in those areas. So again, there's that line, that single thread going through those, and you're basing all of that on your data. So once you have those goals in place, you can then develop the services and activities that are going to reasonably enable the student to make progress towards those measurable post-secondary goals. So you're using predictors of post-school success and best practices to identify those 3 listed there. So for transition activities, we're looking for an activity that the student performs. In fact, all 3 of these are things the student is doing. So transition activities are typically kind of a one and done activity that the student is going to do that can take place in multiple environments, multiple times of the year. It does not have to happen during the school day, during the school year. It could be something that happens in a class, but it's not a whole class, so it could be an assignment. So some examples might be completing the photography project. There might be specifics to that, or it could be attending a pre-ETS workshop. Again, they're lined back to those measurable post-secondary goals. So I mentioned KSAs earlier. If there is a specific KSA the student needs to develop, that might lead you to develop a transition activity where the student can learn that skill, or taking a course of study that will provide that student the knowledge that they need for that future career. So courses of study then are at least, at a minimum, it's at least one course within their 4 years in high school that it's going to support their measurable post-secondary goals. So one per measurable post-secondary goal. But ideally, you're looking at least for best practices each school year. What are some courses that are going to support them? And then again, the aligned annual IEP goals. What is that connection between their disability related need and that skill they're working on to transition into their post-secondary environment? So you can use the KSAs again. Perhaps the student has a disability in reading comprehension, and that is a KSA needed for their job. So what is that annual IEP goal that they're working on in reading comprehension, and what is something they're going to have to do in that job that requires reading comprehension? So we talk about using an in order to statement. So if you were to have your annual IEP goal, and I'm really bad at thinking of examples right now, I have some in the slides, but you have your annual IEP goal related to reading comprehension, and then the statement in order to complete work tasks that require reading, something like that, to make that connection very, very clear. So once the student is participating in all of those activities, courses, they're working towards their goals, that becomes data for your next round of age-appropriate transition assessments. It won't be everything, but it's a really good foundation to start with and kind of guide what other assessments you may have to perform. So it allows you to then update your plan annually. Remember that component. And another piece to all of these steps is think about how agencies like Workability or your VR counselors, where they could be providing some of this data. They could be hosting a transition activity. And so they're also supporting so many aspects of the transition planning process. So that, and then the student himself or herself is also needs to be an active participant in all of these steps. And so their input, again, is really critical when they're invited to the meeting. So I kind of rounded it out with all of those 8 components there. So I know I've been talking nonstop for like 10, 15 minutes. Are there any questions or sticky points on any of this that I can go deeper into a slide here?
I don't see anything in the chat.
Just to clarify, this is best practice, not necessarily the minimum requirement, right?
Right. So, I mean, it's the foundation is in those requirements for indicator 13. And, I can just take a moment here to kind of backtrack out of my slides and show you the website to find all of those, what the program supported monitoring specialists look at. So here first is our secondary transition website, which I'll just put in the chat for you. Hold on here. This is kind of a great site to maybe have bookmarked if you need it. There's a lot of other announcements here on this page. If I keep scrolling down, again, you could read this narrative where it's going to give some of those requirements like I just reviewed, a picture of the process. We don't have the updates now, but there's some upcoming professional development that you'll find there, other recorded webinars that are linked there, and some other resources. So I just wanted to introduce you to that page, but to find those requirements, Heather, one place you can go is just looking on the side here to see if it's linked. It's not. So we're going to go to the ESS homepage, and we're going to find that program support and monitoring unit. And if you go down to their resources section, they have their 2021-2022 guide steps. And so this is their big document that goes through all of the indicators that they're looking for. And if I just do a Control F to find, we're going to look up transition. I spelled that wrong. And it's going to go through early transition. So I think I have to do a couple clicks here. Actually, okay, so this section is on page 39. If you're following along, I'll give you this link too. There you go. So here is where you'll actually find kind of those bare bone requirements, the student file review method. So you see what we're looking for when we're looking for compliance. And you see some actual examples of, so here's what we might see as, I think these are the measurable post-secondary goals. So student will work for a construction company, or student will be employed as a grocery clerk. Best practice examples would include clarifying this is a post-secondary goal. After graduation, student will work as a grocery clerk. Best practice would also say if you have the data to support they're going to work full-time or part-time, that can be in the goal. If you have the data to say exactly which grocery store the student will work at, you can add that in there. If there's a specific job title that that grocery store chain might use instead of grocery store clerk, that could also be in that goal. So best practice really allows you to enhance the goal based on that data and what the student has provided, and to really truly write that plan for the student. So this is a great tool. I know our team constantly looks back at it too, just to make sure what we're speaking to is accurate, even though we're really focusing on best practices. But that visual that I showed you can be used to talk through all of these, the bare bones compliance pieces as well. Because you are looking, again, when you're looking for assessments, you're looking for those strengths, preferences, interests, and the consideration of needs. That's coming directly out of the IDEA. While I'm in Chrome, I'm also going to give you access to our Padlet dashboard. So you can find some of the other trainings that we offered, the copies of those presentations, where you'll find a lot of the slides that I just went over on our training tools Padlet. We also have just a general secondary transition resources Padlet. So we have links to some national, statewide, local agencies, some other great resources, I think, related to person-centered planning, student engagement. And then we also have one related to age-appropriate transition assessments. So if you are looking for assessments, and because you need to find some SPIN data and you're not quite sure what assessment is going to help you, there are, I would say it's probably close to 100 different assessments on this Padlet here. And then we have a post-school outcomes one that's really dedicated to those staff members who are involved in that post-school outcomes data collection. So there's some recorded webinars, the actual surveys on there. So feel free to check out those Padlets. Were there any other questions about the transition planning process? Because as you can see, I have a lot of extra slides here, and I can kind of jump around if there were some sticky points.
I feel like we have time, Sam. I mean, if the group is open and if you feel like sharing your extra slides.
I mean, I kind of tried when I went over the plan to really talk through what I think is on these slides too, so I don't want to repeat myself. But again, if there are some clear points, like if you want to talk more about transition activities or anything, we can focus on an area.
Well, I would be curious to hear, you know, I know that there's pre-ETs and TSWs going on, and those are all transition. And then I know there are specific programs like Project Search, and then we have ACT, and those are sort of like transition-based programs. I mean, I would be curious how all of that is playing into some of this stuff, and if we're feeling like those programs have really supported the outcomes. Now, I'm curious. I mean, I know pre-ETs is relatively new, and it's kind of like, but I would be curious about that data as well, like to see how that plays out later. But
yeah, so what I can tell you, we do, so the agency, we do have a data sharing agreement with vocational rehabilitation. And so once a year, we exchange data, and they can send us a list of all of the students who are receiving or have received VR services within that year. And so then we align that with our post-school outcomes data, and we can kind of look at, okay, the student received VR services, what are their post-school outcomes? I don't have that data here. We're still, none of us are data researchers, so we're still trying to kind of build those templates, but we do have access to it, and we're trying to create that. I think with programs like Project Search, ACT, that kind of goes back to the district level. All the districts have access to the online application where they input their survey data. So they can pull their own data, and they know that they're students. So they can pull their group of students that were in the ACT program, for example, or a TSW program, and look at that specific data and filter it out. Some districts, I'm not really sure if anyone in Pima County is doing this, but like I know Mesa, for example, and I think Peoria, they have TSW programs, and they actually ask additional questions to their PSO survey to kind of gather information, like, did you stay in contact with your VR counselor? Are you still enrolled in that program? Or they'll ask some other additional questions. Did you like TSW? Things like that to address their program. So I know we've talked to, like, I think Sunnyside, that was an idea that they had to implement. So I haven't heard if anyone's doing that quite yet, but that's another source of some of that data.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
And I see Claudia, yeah, on our PSO Padlet, the actual survey questions there. So you can see what questions are getting asked. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of them align to things that I think VR counselors collect. I mean, you kind of know how much they're getting paid, and if they're getting, well, they have to get minimum wage, I guess, but how many hours they're working, what kind of setting they're working in. So I think sometimes VR counselors might get contacted by schools to support some of the questions that are being asked that a student might not know, or to maybe even help get reconnected with a student a year later. Any other points or questions about the transition planning process, or should we dive into post-school outcomes?
I just have to add that I like the COVID-19 question, because I was wondering how that would impact the post-school outcome data. So I noticed there's one about COVID-19 that I would assume has been added. So that's interesting.
Yes, we put that question in place last year. So during our 2020 summer. So PSO data is collected in the summer for the students who left high school the year before. And so let me show you the question that Claudia is referring to. So it's an optional question. So we've collected now for 2 years, just to find out if COVID-19 policies, or really COVID-19 impacted them in any of these areas that impacts their post-school engagement that we're measuring. So did it impact whether or not they got into some kind of training program, went to work, the support services they received, or sometimes we'll hear other. I had a quick look at what we received this year. Some of the other responses that I've seen include everything from, I actually worked more hours, or I had no impact, or my family didn't want me to work because we had like a high risk uncle or grandpa that was living with us, and so I wanted to stay home, or I put off going to college or doing something because of the pandemic, or I had a complete change of plans because maybe, I think I saw in some cases like a missionary got canceled, and so they did something else, or they decided to go into the military or something instead. So we've been collecting that, and it's just optional. So I think out of the like 6,000 some responses we got last year, maybe we had about 2,000 people actually respond to that information. And we're still really diving into it. Again, none of us are data researchers, so we're doing our best to look at what we have and be able to digest it and present it. Let me skip down to my post-school outcomes slides. And again, we can always jump back to any other parts of the conversation. So we talked through the requirements of indicator 13, but indicator 14 is that measurement of a student's post-school engagement. And we're looking at very specific types of engagement. So we're looking at surveying the students 1 year after they've left secondary school. They had IEPs when they exited, and they exited by graduating, dropping out, or aging out. And within that year, the specific 4 areas that we're looking at whether or not they were engaged is if they were in higher education, competitively employed, enrolled in some other post-secondary education or training, or in some other type of employment, all within that 1 year after they've left high school. And so the survey itself, itself doesn't open until June 1st, a year after they've exited. So if they exited in May, so this upcoming year, students who graduated May 2021 are going to be surveyed in June 2022. We were just talking about saying all of these years. And so it's a little funny when we think PSO, because it's always that 1 year later. So so if you're currently working with students that are going to graduate this May 2022, they're not going to be surveyed for another year, but it's really helpful for them to be aware of, hey, somebody's going to call you next summer. You know, you're going to get a survey that you're going to have to respond to. And it's not mandatory, but we really hope to get high response rates throughout the state. And Arizona does actually a really phenomenal job nationwide, or compared to other states nationwide, when it comes to our response rates. So when we're looking at those specific categories of engagement, again, there's very specific criteria that we're looking for. And these definitions are set again by the Office of Special Education Programs. So they're coming down from the federal level. So for higher education, we're looking at a community college or college university. So 2 or 4 year program. The student is enrolled full or part-time, but the criteria here is that they've at least completed a full term. And that term is defined by the institution. It could be a quarter, it could be a semester, could have been even like a summer 8-week course or something like that. So at least there was a start date, an end date, and the student completed that. For competitive employment, this is a definition that we aligned with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So since the summer of 2019, we have been following this specific definition. So when we're looking at competitive employment, first I will share it does include military employment. That's one, so if somebody's in the military, we know that they meet the criteria for competitive employment. But the other pieces that we're looking for is the student is working an average of 20 hours a week. So again, that's an average. It could be 20 hours one, 30 hours the next, 40 hours the next, but just the average. They've at least worked 90 days. So our education and training, we're looking for a full term. For competitive and the other employment, we're looking for at least 90 days cumulative. Unfortunately, that could be a student who worked 30 days in one job, 30 days in another, 30 days in another. And adding that up, they've worked 90 days. Ideally, it's in one job, but we've seen it in multiple jobs. So at least working for 90 days. They work for a pay that is at or above minimum wage. And they're also earning that customary pay rate that anyone with or without a disability would be entitled to for that job, for that level of experience the student is bringing to that job. So if you have a job advertisement that says that the individual would get $15 an hour, that's what the customary pay rate would be for that job, even if minimum wage is lower than that. And we're also looking for a setting that's integrated. So a setting where there's individuals who do not have disabilities, and there is a level of interaction for that student with the disability that is comparable to the coworkers who do not have disabilities but are working the same job. So this does not mean that the individual with the disability is only interacting with the job coach or with the supervisor. They're actually collaborating with their coworkers to solve problems, to just get through the workday. So that idea is that there's that level of interaction that anyone would expect in that same job. And then we're looking for available benefits and opportunities for advancements as those without disabilities. So that doesn't necessarily mean the student obtained benefits, like maybe they were offered benefits, but they're under mom and dad's health insurance, so they didn't take it. Or they didn't actually get a raise yet or a promotion, but it's just available to them. Because if you've only worked 90 days, you probably haven't gotten a promotion or a raise yet, maybe, but at least it's available to you. Some benefits could even be like that discount that employees get maybe at the restaurant. I remember when I worked at a restaurant, we got 50% off meals on our shift. I mean, that's still a benefit that's available to you. So there's some specific pieces to competitive employment. And if you looked at that survey, all of the questions are worded in a way to capture this information. So other post-secondary education and training is going to cover any other kind of education or training program that's less than the 2 or 4 year college. And again, they're completing one full term. In this case, that full term could be a 2-hour training course or an 8-hour training course or a certificate program. Again, the student must have completed it. And then other employment, we're still looking for pay. Might not be quite minimum wage. If we think about maybe a student who runs an Etsy shop or a food truck, they might not, when you calculate it, they're not really making minimum wage, but they're still working for pay. They have still worked at least 90 days. And then some examples here, it could be working like in a family business, could be self-employment. So there's a lot of other, that's why it's kind of the other, there's a lot of room, wiggle room there for what that could mean for the student. Any questions on those specific definitions?
I have one quick question. So the other employment would capture a student who chose to work like 10 hours a week regularly? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That's, yeah, so those students that maybe meet some of those other criteria for competitive employment, but not quite the average of 20 hours, they'd fall into other. Or maybe they work an average of 20 hours, but maybe they aren't having that level of interaction that is necessary. So if they didn't meet one of those other components for competitive, but they've met pay in 90 days, they fall into that other category. So let's dive into some of the results. So for this last data collection season, which occurred June 1 through September 30th of 2021, these were including students who had IEPs when they exited in the 1920 school year. So they exited at the beginning of the pandemic. So statewide, we had a 78.72% response rate. Our goal has always been 80%, so we've been pretty close even during a pandemic the last 2 years. So we had over 6,000 students across the state respond. There were nearly 8,000 students who were eligible for this survey this year. So they were those students that had exited in the 1920 school year. So across the state, we have 282 charters and districts that have students eligible for the survey. And that's typically the same every year, 280 to 283 charters and districts. And then in Pima County, as you can see, we had a 77.33% response rate, so really close to what happens statewide. There are nearly 1,000 respondents in Pima County, so about 1,200 were actually eligible, and 969 responded to the survey. And that's out of 44 different charters and districts in Pima County. Pretty crazy to think about that there's 44 in the county. And some of those are some really tiny charters that don't have a lot, or sometimes it could be an elementary district. But those are 44 potential members to the community of practice, if you think about it that way. So when we look at the measurement criteria for indicator 14, they're looking again at those 4 categories of engagement, but there's only 3 measurements. So measurement A is higher education, so just that one category of engagement. I will say that this dropped this last year, so we have 18.6%, and let me pull up my notes over here. Last year statewide, it was 21.9%. So we do know that nationwide, there was a huge drop in higher education enrollment. So that's something that's reflective here in our data as well. We hope, as the pandemic fluctuates and changes, that students are going back into college, and we're going to see that percentage jump up. But Arizona was 18.6%, Pima County was 19% of our respondents going into higher education. So measurement B is that combination of higher education and competitive employment. So statewide, we're seeing 56.2% of our students. Last year, statewide, it was 55.3%. So that number jumped a little bit too. So maybe some of those students that weren't going into higher education chose to go to work instead, and they were still finding that successful. In Pima County this last year, we had 52.3% of the respondents were in higher ed plus competitive employment. And then measurement C, I often call that the overall engagement rate, because that's engagement in any of those 4 categories. So statewide, we were at 71.8. Pima County was 71.1, so quite close to what was happening statewide. And those are the 3 measurements that we report on. We don't technically report on the not engaged, but that's kind of what's left. Those students who maybe didn't do anything. It could be the students who attempted engagement. Maybe they didn't quite meet the 90-day criteria, or they didn't complete a full term. So there's that group there too that we can look into a little bit more in depth down the road, you know, who maybe tried to be engaged but didn't quite meet it. Maybe they didn't start looking for a job until June and then didn't find a job until August and couldn't meet the 90 days within our survey timeframe. So when we see not engaged and we see, you know, 28.9% in Pima County, you know, it's only reflective of what's happening within that year since they've exited. It's only reflective of if they meet the criteria for those 4 engagement categories, because there are students that maybe be stay-at-home caretakers or parents even, and that doesn't necessarily meet our criteria. But when school staff are reaching out to former students, they can get a little creative in their questions to find out, you know, if you're a stay-at-home parent, well, did you maybe do any kind of parenting classes before you had your child? And that might actually align with other education and training. So there's a lot of opportunities that fall into these categories of engagement, especially those 2 others, that we have to be a little creative when we're having those conversations while administering the survey. So if we look a little bit more just into Pima County and those 4 engagement categories, as well as the not engaged, you can see the breakout of the measurements here. So 19% again that were in higher education, but we had 33.3% that went into competitive employment. And you see our 2 others, which are pretty similar to what we've seen statewide as well. I also wanted to give you a perspective of what is happening in different counties across Arizona. So this slide is pretty busy here, but it breaks down all 15 counties, and you can see across the 4 engagement categories and not engaged, what's happening in those counties, where are students engaged in a year later. And there's not necessarily a county that's comparable to Pima. If you look number wise, we have 969 respondents. The closest to that, I guess, would be Pinell at 329, and then there's Maricopa at 3,785. So there's not really one that you can compare apples to apples here, but you can get a perspective of what you might know about some different counties. So what you know about the population living there, the resources available in some of those counties. In some cases, maybe what even happened with the pandemic this last year and how that might have impacted some of the engagement of some of these students. So again, you see Pima County in the mix. We do on our post-school outcomes website do have a report for all of our statewide data. So it includes this chart as well as some breakdowns by demographic areas statewide and what's happening. Any questions so far? Okay. Well, I do have just a couple slides on some demographic information. So what we pull, we can look at 4 different areas. We can look at exit reasons. So again, graduated, dropped out, or aged out. We can look at the different ethnicities of our students, gender, and then disability category. And even though there was 969 respondents in Pima County, when I broke it down to some of these demographics, those numbers were really, really small. And so I didn't feel comfortable sharing just to protect student confidentiality. So I do have slides on gender and then kind of 4 broad disability category areas. But on the side here, I do have those other charts that I can speak to and respond to questions. So just to give you a perspective of some of the demographic data we have access to, and then as if any of you at the district level, I think most of you are, we have a lot of outside agencies, Project Search here, but school districts do have access to their data at these 4 different levels too. So if, you know, some of our like Vail, Sunnyside, TUSD wanted to take their post-school outcomes data and break it down to these demographic areas, they could, and they could see what's happening within their own districts. They could break it down by campus level and see what's happening. So if I jump into what I have for gender, you can see that most of the students that responded or exited in Pima County are male. We do see that all 4 engagement categories are represented with both populations of these students. But as we're kind of seeing what's happening statewide too, the percentage of females going into higher education is typically higher than the percentage of males going into higher education. But the percentage of males going into competitive employment is usually higher than the percentage of females going into that same engagement category. That's something that we've seen statewide. Again, when you look at the ends, we have nearly double the number of males that are involved in the post-school outcomes survey. So even that 27.5% of males who are not engaged is going to be a higher number of individual former students than we have as females. So if you're thinking about those students who are currently enrolled or you're currently supporting, those are the students that we might see in that not engaged category one day. And so what are some supports that we can offer? What are some resources that we can provide to help them become engaged in the future? So I wanted to show you the gender data. I can speak to exit reasons. So most of the students who left high school in the 1920 school year in Pima County graduated. 81.6 of those students were graduates, so 791 students. And for the students who dropped out, that was 177 students. And the most common category of engagement we saw for students who dropped out was this other post-secondary education and training. So we don't know the details on that, but that could be maybe they're getting dropout recovery programs or getting their GED or adult education programs. The most common category that we saw for students who graduated was competitive employment, which is reflective of that's our most popular category of engagement, which is good to see when it's a year out. That's what a lot of students do, especially if they're taking maybe a year off before they go to college. They're just working. That makes sense. So when I break it down into some disability categories here, so what I have here are just the 4 that we typically report on instead of the, I think, 15 disability categories that are out there. So the all other disabilities is including a lot of our low incidence disabilities. We're including autism, other health impairment, orthopedic impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual hearing impairments, all kind of fall into that all other disabilities category. Emotional disability, that's including our students with emotional disabilities as well as those that are in private placement. Intellectual disability includes the mild, moderate, and severe intellectual disability. And then SLD is kind of on its own. That's our students with disabilities. Most of them do have a specific learning disability. That's our highest number. And that's what we see here too at 529 of our 969 respondents identified as having a specific learning disability. So you can see that perspective of where they've landed. Again, we want to celebrate all categories of engagement were achieved by a few or more of the students with some of these disabilities, including even students with intellectual disabilities. Some of them met the criteria for higher education. And again, when you look at the numbers, it's hard to compare. I mean, when you see 20.8% of students with an SLD were not engaged, that's going to be a higher number of students than when you look at 44.9% of students with intellectual disabilities aren't engaged. So it's hard to make that side-by-side comparison without looking at the ends themselves. On the side here, I do have some notes just to highlight. So when we think about some of the other disabilities, I will share that out of our students who have autism, 56.9% were engaged in some category. Our students with other health impairments, that often includes, it could be medical disabilities, could be ADHD. Those students also, 69.7% of those were also engaged. When I look at some of the intellectual disability categories, there were more engagement for students who had a mild intellectual disability than we see with moderate or severe intellectual disabilities. But we still do see most categories of engagement are identified by our students. So, we're using the data, like I said, about the transition planning process to support our students and not, being biased about a certain disability category and what they can do after they leave high school, or really being supportive of all the different avenues and hopefully supporting all of the different categories of engagement. So that is what I had for data slides, and I did want to open it up to a conversation. If you have any questions, again, either about PSO or about some of the transition plan pieces, we can review those, but maybe we can have a quick discussion, just, what are some next steps that we can do knowing this information?
I'll jump in here if that's okay with you guys.
Go for it.
I think the explanation of, like, for PIMA JTED, we do a placement survey that's similar to like post-secondary outcomes, and then we share it with districts. And then we also reach out to VR counselors if we can't get a hold of our interns because of, they've exited, the contact information is different. But the other employment piece, I think, is really helpful, because I know in the past, at least working for the district, it was hard because they didn't meet that 20 hours part. So knowing that if they are still engaged in some way, shape, or form and meet some of the criteria for it, but it's not the competitive, but it falls under other employment, is like, wonderful, woohoo! That means our engagement then goes up, 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 which is great. So thank you for that, Sam. That's super helpful.
No problem. We actually, in the last couple of years, updated that question in the survey. So it used to just say, do you work 20 hours or more? Yes, no, no answer. But now we broke it down. So if you choose this 20 to 29 or 30 or more, you fall into competitive employment, or it's supporting you for that definition. But now you can actually choose some of these options, knowing that that fits other employment. But it allows the districts too to go back and say, maybe look at students with an intellectual disability and look at how many hours they're working, or a specific gender, how many hours are male and females working. So we can look at that a little bit more. So I'm glad that you picked that up.
I just wanted to say I found it interesting that there was a decline across the board in going into like a college setting, because I typically have about 4 to 5 students in my program every year that they want to pursue like PIMA after Project Search, and I have 0 this year. So it's very interesting to see that trend across the board too. And I thought it was interesting just in my group alone. So I don't know, maybe I need to do a little more college exploration too for students.
I think it's also important to recognize that college isn't for everybody, and you have to support. I mean, just because there's the hierarchy here and saying measurement A, which we have to think A is the best for, grade wise. But higher education doesn't always have to be the best or most appropriate option. So yeah, it might have dropped, but look back into what the student is going to benefit from and what training that they need.
Also, I found several of my clients were not successful in college because of the pandemic and everything being virtual. And so then they went into the workforce. And so that's kind of makes sense with what happened last year.
I was just going to chime in and say too, that a lot of people, what I've noticed as well is some people don't do college till later. And that's because sometimes it takes time for people to mature and have some life experiences before they're ready to do that. And, I know my brother who's on the spectrum, he was told many times, this is back in the 80s, but that, he wasn't really going to be successful for college. He wasn't meeting the requirements, right? The assessments. But when he got into his 30s, he passed his assessments and he's in school right now getting his bachelor's degree. And so, but it took him time to develop more skills, as he aged and matured more. And I think that happens a lot with our population. They might not be ready when they leave high school, but they'll be ready in 5 or 8 years, and so I think, college is huge. I mean, I'm with you, Nikki, around that, I think, or Soshi, which one of you brought it up, but I think college is really a great option for people, but it might not happen right away.
I think something else about college is sometimes students, especially students with disabilities, don't work in high school at the rate that students without disabilities do work. So they don't have a lot of work experience and they need more career exploration. And so I think from a VR counselor standpoint, I don't know that I would support a student going into college when they really don't have any idea what they want to do, what it's like. I mean, they kind of need to get a feel for what it's like to work before they commit to something and engage in further education.
Yeah, sometimes work is a way to get us on track, like those first jobs. It's like, oh yeah, you learn so many skills from those hands-on entry-level jobs that support further learning down the line. So, but yeah, this was so great, Sam.
Well, thank you. I mean, I want to thank all of the educators and all of you who really support these students to have these post-school outcomes. I mean, I'm just there to present the data and to support the schools and capturing it and getting it into our system every year.
I have a different question that I've wondered lately. I remember it was life-changing when I found out, I think it was 2 years ago, that I could share with the school staff when they were doing their post-outcome information about students and where they were now. Does that go both ways? Because occasionally students lose contact with me, but I hear teachers talking that they've had contact with a student that graduated. Are they able to share that information with me? I was just wondering if that goes both ways.
I don't really think so. I think for the post-school outcome survey, state agency representatives can be one group that responds to the survey. And so that's partly why it's allowed. But for schools, there might just be some additional kind of paperwork involved, or releases of information, whatnot. But it could go district by district and what their requirements are. But for you guys to respond to the survey, it kind of aligns back to, you can't, like, we're looking for state agency representatives as respondents. But I think have that conversation. I mean, just see where it takes you. Because ultimately, we're all, I mean, districts are going to want their students to reconnect with you as well. So, I mean, whether it's, them giving you the information or them taking the time, oh, Claudia can't reach so-and-so, I will call them and say, hey, you need to go to hold of Claudia, and just be that middleman. I mean, if you don't have that conversation, they don't know to make that contact.
Thank you.
Sam, do you have the data on the outcomes for students in TSW programs versus non-TSW programs?
So that again comes from Voc Rehab, and I think the last couple of years it was sometimes it was accurate and sometimes it was not, because sometimes I think from your perspective it might have been how the students are getting input into the VR system, if they're listed as TSW or if they're listed as like a different type of client. And so there was some messiness with some of the data that was coming our way, and I think that's gotten resolved now. So down the road we can, but again, if you request that from the district or talk with the districts, they have access to that. So like I was saying, let's say Vail, for example, James would have a list of all of their students that are in TSW programs. He can filter those specific students out of their raw data from the PSO application and kind of create that information too. So have those conversations with your districts as well, because we do have a Excel template on our website that creates similar charts like this. So if they were to filter the data and take those students out and then just look at the charts for those students in the programs, they can make that happen.
I'm thinking about that, and to answer your question about what we can do as a community of practice on transition. And I would imagine that we would see correlation with students who are engaged in TSW programs in school and post-school outcomes. And so maybe we could utilize that to, I don't know, advertise building TSW programs within schools, or, I mean, because I know we have that statistic that the success of a client is largely dependent on the relationship with the counselor, which, when we start to get really overwhelmed that we're not doing anything, then we can focus on our relationship with our client know that that's actually making a really big impact. So I'm just wondering if we can pull some data like that out, and use that as a community practice.
Yeah, I think have the conversations with some of the individual school districts. And I just know from the statewide level, we have that data sharing agreement. So we're working on building those. But, you know, the state, we go pretty slowly sometimes. So feel free to kind of connect with some of your key partners at the districts and work with them. And you're happy to reach out. I'll put our ESS transition inbox email in the chat so that you can also reach out to us for support. Since I've stepped away from the team, we have Lisa Livesay, who is our main post-school outcomes point of contact. I will put a plug. We're going to be posting 3 positions in January, 2 for a transition specialist. That would be, I believe they would be statewide. So there we have a Tucson office, a Flagstaff office, and a Phoenix office. So those 2 positions will be posted. And then in our Phoenix office, we're looking for kind of an admin staff, somebody who would support the post-school outcomes project. So I know we're all in Tucson, but there'll be at least 2 positions posted in January. One is my old position, so really focus on PSO, and then the other one's a typical transition specialist. So no focus on PSO with that one, just a little bit. I'll put that plug. So we're a little short-staffed on the team right now. So some of this data stuff, you know, again, might take a little bit of time. So if there's anything that you can do locally, have at it.
Does anybody have any other questions for Sam? Or any comments or thoughts? I wanted to just to remind everybody too, we sent the link out, the agenda. So please feel free on the below if you want to share any updates to please do that. And, you know, we didn't make time for that today, but maybe in the future ones, there could be time for that. I'm sorry about that. But also our Padlet is also a great way to share updates as well. And again, we want to thank Sam for taking some time today to join us. And thank you all again for the lovely Jamboard. Thank you. I actually had time to read through it when my camera was off, and very, very sweet and thoughtful. And don't forget about tomorrow night's happy hour at Trident. And
Thursday.
What's that?
It's Thursday, right?
Is it Thursday? I'm so sorry. My days are all kind of running in together. As Sam was talking about, we're also struggling with staffing, and I'm doing more than usual. So my days are beginning to kind of do that. But Thursday, Trident, Swan, and Camp Lowell, Plaza Palomino, come join us. And I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. Or, yep,